Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop. This time we're building this wall hanging display cabinet thing that I'm using to store all the router bits in my shop. It is very excessive with a fancy custom back panel, some through miter dovetails for the case joinery, and a mitered frame door on the front there. So plenty excessive for something that's going to be hanging in the shop. So a big thank you to MLCS Woodworking for sponsoring this video. Let's get started. So to get started with the actual planning for the cabinet and figure out how big it needs to be and what it needs to store, I'm going to kind of go through all of my router bits and accessories and kind of organize things and figure out what all has to go in here. So this is how I've been storing my router bits up until now. I got a nice box full of stuff. So all that stuff has to go into a cabinet. But what's really cool is MLCS sent out one of their multi-bit sets. Oh, that's foam. One of their multi-bit sets here. This is their 30-piece set, which means that I can basically get rid of the basic starter kits that I got when I first started woodworking like 10 or 11 years ago. A lot of these bits didn't really cut that well to begin with. A lot of them are dull now, and a lot of them have broken and it's worn out over the years. So I can kind of reduce things a little bit and have a full quality set in the cabinet. So after spending a few moments kind of laying things out and getting a feel for what I have, I've realized two things. First off, I don't have as many router bits as I actually thought. And the other thing is these cases and things, they take up a lot of space. So it's going to be nice to be rid of all of those things. Now the idea with the cases is that you always have the information for the bit, but in practice here, at least for me, I've never actually had these bits back in the actual cases. And a lot of times I'm not sure which bit goes to which case anyway, and I've been surviving just fine that way. So I'm not too worried about not having the cases, and it's gonna be nice to not have all the extra crap here in the shop. And then of course, besides just router bits, I do want to store other things in this cabinet that may be router related or maybe router table related. So some of the bigger things I have are like the feather boards for the router table. Those can be stored in this cabinet as well. So I'm thinking of having an area below the bit storage, maybe about 6 inches tall, that would allow me to store these type of things. I also have a few other larger things like the wrenches for the router, the lift crank thing, and a few larger bits that might be just nicer to have in the case that I can store in that lower kind of cubby area at the bottom of the cabinet. And then some of the other bigger non-router bit stuff is going to be like the guide bushings. I also have this other set here for my Triton router. So we just laying things out roughly, I can see how big I want to make this thing. I'm using this box kind of as an idea of what you can pack into a smaller area. So I'm thinking that this will be the total height here. This will give me a 6-inch tall area at the bottom here to store accessories and things, and then I'll have the bit rack above there. Now as far as the width, I'm going to go a little bit wider. So I'm going to go out to maybe 16 or 18 inches wide for the internal dimension of the case. And then the overall height is going to be right around 28 inches. Now one more thing we can think about is the overall depth of this case. And for that I can use this bit set as sort of a guide as well. So looking at it right now, maybe about 2 inches deep will get you this single row. But I'm thinking if I want to have 2 rows of stuff chilling in here, you know, maybe at 3.5 to 4 inches deep on the internal would be just about right for that. So here's my overall plan. So I have my outside dimensions, which I need to actually make my lumber. And then I want to think about the width of the pieces I'm going to need for the sides. So I want my 4-inch depth. I'm going to have a 1/2-inch back panel. And then I also want to put a door on here. So it's going to be a 3/4 inch thickness. So that's a total depth of 5 1/4. That's really all the information that I need to get started on this project. So for the materials for this, I have this piece of elm. This is from the same log that I made my tool cabinet out of. So this cabinet should match that one really nicely. Now if you look at the end here, this is from the outside of the log. So we have mostly a flat sawn piece of wood here, which is actually pretty great for this project. That'll give me some nice traditional sort of cathedral patterns for the sides of the case. And then the edges of the board are going to be closer to quarter sawn. So it's going to give me a lot of nice straight grain material out here. So what I can do is actually cut the sides from out here and then slice this into actual boards and have pieces for the doors, which are going to be more quarter sawn, and I can use the flat sawn stock for the case. Now the other nice thing about this is that it is 10 quarters, so I'm able to resaw the sides and the top and bottom out of one piece. So what I can do here is have a continuous grain wrap around the entire case, which isn't all that necessary for something like this, where you're not going to see the top and bottom that often, but it's just kind of a fun technique to do if you have the opportunity to have either 2 sequential boards or a thicker piece that you can cut 2 sequential boards out of. So I can clip this end right here, and this will become the case side, and this will become the case bottom up to here, and that'll give me all the stock for the main case. As far as the width goes, I got plenty of width here, even with this wane that can come off, because my final case can come out to be about here, and then I can resaw this into strips, which will give me the stock for the door. So I'm going to go ahead and start cutting this up and breaking it down into the individual parts. And before I process the main board into the sides, top and bottom, I'll resaw, or basically just rip off the strips that become the stock for the doors. This piece of elm, being closer to the outside of the log, has a bunch of these kind of burly type of inclusions in it, so it's kind of a cool piece of wood. So this should make a pretty nice little cabinet just hanging up on the wall. So these boards have been sitting in the shop for a few weeks. I did some epoxy fills on the cracks and little knot holes down here. So those are kind of taken care of and out of the way. So now at this point, it's time to start building this thing, which is crazy, super exciting. So these boards are going to go through the entire milling process once again, bring them back into flat, bring them down to final thickness, like I ripped down to final width, and then I can start cutting them down to final length for the case sides and the top and bottom. So since we're going for a continuous grain wrap on this case, the only thing I need to really make sure I keep in mind when making the cuts to make all of the pieces out of here is that one of the sides will be from the right side of one board and one of the sides will be from the left side of one board. So as I am separating the pieces with my stop block, all I have to do is make sure I'm kind of rotating things end for end, so I make sure I keep that alignment perfect as the grain wraps all the way around the entire box. So now we're going to start doing some joinery on here, and for this I'm going to use the same joinery that I used on the hand tool cabinet here, the mitered through dovetail, because, you know, shop furniture has to match and stuff. So these mitered through dovetails start with cutting the tailboard, and I'll do that at the bandsaw with an angle jig. That way I can really quickly and repeatably make all the same cuts on all of the pieces, or I guess the 2 sides, since I'll have the tails on the side of the case. And I can go through and make all of the cuts for all those tail pieces all at once with one fence setting, and I'll have nice consistent symmetrical tails between all the parts. I'm going to omit the front corner at this point because that's going to be mitered and that'll have to be cut by hand. Then back at the bench, I can do a little cleanup work to get rid of all the waste from between the tails, and then I can start working on cutting the actual miter, which is going to start off by cutting the last tail. That's going to be cut from the inside, and it's going to be cut from the scribe line up to the outside corner. Once that cut is made, the actual miter can be cut, and then a guide block with a chisel can be used to clean up that area and make it a perfect 45. So that takes care of the tailboard. Now that can be transferred over to the pin board, and that pin board can be cut as well. To cut the pins, I'll just do that with a handsaw, and then I'll use the bandsaw to remove the majority of the waste, and then the remaining waste can be cleaned up right back to the scribe line with a chisel. The last little detail on here is to miter that first pin, so I'll make a rough cut with a handsaw, and then use the guide block with a chisel again to pare the area back and make it perfect so it matches up nicely with the tailboard. So So the box for the case is all joined and assembled, and the next thing for this thing is going to be to get the rabbet cut for the back panel. But I don't know how thick the back panel is yet because I haven't made it yet. And I want to do something kind of interesting for the back and get rid of some scraps. So I have this scrap of 1/2-inch plywood. I also have this offcut from the guitar blank that I made when I made a guitar over in the UK at Cremona Guitars. So I have this interesting piece of silver maple, which has some interesting figure and curl. And I'm going to saw into some veneers and see what I can do with that. Maybe I can make some kind of cool pattern or some kind of goofy thing out of it. Don't really know yet, but I know the back panel is going to be this wood and it's going to be attached to that piece of plywood somehow. And the first step in that process is bandsaw time. So I'll see you on the other side of doing a bunch of veneer sawing. So this is kind of the goofy pattern I came up with. I got a little book match over here, and I have this kind of live edge thing going over here. I think I might take this little chunk off of here and kind of fill in some of this area. I might put a piece of this over here. I'm a little bit over width and I'm over length as well, so I can kind of play with this a little bit. But yeah, the first thing that's going to happen here is I have to get the book match pair. I have to get that seam put together a little bit nicer, get them glued together, and then this can all be veneered down to this panel whenever I kind of figure out a final layout. So while the glue sets up on that, let's make a backing veneer for the back side of the panel. I have this little strip of ash that's left over from when I did my hardwood flooring project. It's not going to become anything too exciting. It's been like this for a few years, so it might as well face the back of this cabinet and just face a wall for the rest of its life. So I can cut this up into rough length and then spend some time with the bandsaw resawing it into strips, and I'll take those down to the same thickness as the veneer for the front side. So I think it's going to be easiest to press these separately, since this obviously covers the entire thing and the front side is going to have a lot of goofiness to it. So I'm going to do this one first. I'll get some glue applied down to the substrate, stick the veneer down, throw it in the vacuum bag, and we'll come back and take a look at it in a little bit. So I've played around with the layout a little bit. We're still both oversized in this direction and this direction. And I'm thinking the trimming cut to width is going to come in somewhere right here. So it's going to basically square up this kind of glob thing over here and, you know, make it more like this. So I think from here I'm really happy with the way this is all laid out. And I'm going to go ahead and start sticking each piece down. I'm just going to apply glue to the little tiny veneers individually and stick them down in place. I just work through the process, sticking each one down. So I hopefully don't lose the positioning of all of these, although I can always go back and look at the video. But if I can do it without having to worry, then I'll do it that way. So I'm going to start with this big one, get that one stuck down, and then I'll stick down all the small pieces all around it, and then we can throw this thing into the vacuum bag. So I let this sit for a while just to make sure all of the excess moisture from the glue has had time to escape. I just trimmed this thing down closer to its final width, so we're getting down a little bit in size. And I think there might be something wrong with my brain, because when I did the back for this, I thought I had made it actually wider than I needed, but apparently I didn't. So I'm going to have to like glue on some more ash on the back of here, but whatever. That's just how it goes, I guess. But you know where this is heading next. We're going to do a really thin epoxy pour in here and fill in all of that dead space because, yeah. So to contain all the epoxy, I'm going to wrap the edge in some sheathing tape, and then I can start mixing up the resin. This is not a thick pour, so I don't have to use a slow-setting resin for this. We're only 1/8 of an inch thick, but I'm going to put a significant amount of pigment in there because I don't want to see down and see the birch plywood underneath. I want a really dark look. I'm going to add a little bit of micropearl in there to give a little bit more of a metallic kind of look to it, just to give a little more interest than just a really dark, solid color for the epoxies. So I'm really excited about the way this is going to look. I think it's going to make a really bold statement as the back panel of this cabinet. So I think that should look pretty awesome once it's totally done. I think next thing for me is going to be to take the back panel through the entire finishing process so I don't have to worry about it anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and trim it down to rough final size, probably still a little bit bigger than it will be. I'll trim it to final size once the rabbets are cut in the case, and then I can take it through the entire finishing process. And yeah, that should be pretty cool to see all this wood come to life. It's going to make a pretty darn awesome back panel. I think I'm also just going to leave the ash on the back as is with the strip that's kind of missing because it's back of a cabinet and I'm not really that concerned about it. Now the back panel is completed, we know its final thickness, we can go ahead and start making the rabbets which are going to house it in the back of the case. So a couple of these rabbets are going to be stopped so that way the rabbit does not show on the outside of the case. And actually because of the size of the rabbit and my tail layout, I actually need to do stop cuts on the other two pieces as well so I don't actually clip the corner of my tails. So I have marks transferred up onto my fence which show me where the blade enters and exits the table so I know where to start and stop. All right, our case is all ready to go. I finished sanding the inside of this thing, so let's go ahead and get it glued up. So next I'm going to add the horizontal divider in here that will divide out the two kind of areas. And I might kick myself for doing this, but I'm going to use this high temp thermally modified ash, which has a high tendency of chipping and tear out. So that should be an interesting adventure. So this divider is going to be a stopped sliding dovetail. It's going to slide in from the back and you're not going to see it from the front. So it's purely a structural joint, probably overkill for something this small, but it's really going to lock the two sides together, keep them from bowing away from each other, and help them from coming out of their dovetail sockets, which is modern glues. Not a huge deal, but anyway, we're going to start making the actual socket with the dovetail bit in the router. We'll come in here and we'll stop probably about 1 inch or so back from the front edge. We're going to have the thickness of the door there to contend with, so we don't want the divider to go into that area. And since it's going to be stopped, we want to stop a little bit before that too, so probably more like 1.25 inches or so from the front. This is not going to be a super long sliding dovetail by any means. So with the dovetail slots all cut, now I can work on getting the shelf or divider installed. So I'll take my rough stock and run it through the milling process to bring it into flat, square it up, and just get it to rough width. And then to cut it to final length, I'll reference that length directly off of the case and then make that cut to get the final length on that part. I also make a few scrap pieces essentially from the stock, so I have some test pieces or setup pieces for cutting the sliding dovetail on the router table. I'll dial in the fit with those scrap pieces at the table, and then I can run the actual workpiece across the router bit to create that sliding dovetail on the end of the divider. Now, importantly, I left this piece wide for now. That way, if I do have any tear out or blowout on the exit side of the dovetail cut, I can remove that by ripping this thing down to final width. So 4 tries to the perfect fit. That's I think that's pretty average for me. Sometimes I get it in 2, but 4 is probably typical. So we have one little detail to do on here before it actually fits in here, which is going to be to notch out part of the dovetail so that it laps over the case and slides all the way in. So in my case, I need to lap off a 1/8 of an inch, nope, 5/8 of an inch. So I have the blade here set to be 5/8 of an inch off the sled, and I'll make it cut kind of close to the shoulder, pop that block off, and then I'll probably do a little bit of cleanup work over at the bench, and this guy should be good to go into that dovetail slot. So this thing is all ready to go in. Just breaking the edges here. This is finished prepped and ready to go. I am going to use an epoxy for this glue up for one big reason. If you've spent the time to make this a nice piston fit and you use a PVA glue, the water in that glue is going to swell the fibers in here, and it's going to make your piston fit turn into a way too tight fit. So an epoxy or another non-water based glue is not going to swell those fibers and actually help lubricate things as you bring them together. Now the fit on a sliding dovetail is especially important because if it is too loose, what can happen is the piece coming in here can actually be pulled that way. If it gets pulled in that direction, you can open up a gap at the base of the dovetail as well as at the very bottom there. So you actually need a really pretty much perfect fit in order for this to look good basically forever. All right, let's see what happens. Yeah. And that is actually a lot easier than it used to be. Thank you, epoxy. There we go. So I should be able to leave that thing as sitting flush with the back, and now leave the right amount of gap down here for our door. So I'm going to clean this up real quick. The other nice thing about epoxy is the fact that it's not going to interfere with a clear finish. So if I smear the epoxy around right now, not a huge deal because that kind of staining will actually blend into the finish and you'll never know that it was technically glue stained in the first place. So I will leave this sitting out here overnight to cure, and then we can move on from here. All right, check that out. I think this is gonna look really nice. The contrast in here is, yeah, it's looking real good. I put a quarter sawn edge towards the front, so it's got some Rayfleck there, which we'll see when we get some finish on here. I think it's gonna look really nice with the elm. So I'm happy with that contrasting combo match thing there. So next, let's make a door to go in here. So you remember these guys? Let's make a door out of these little offcuts or trimming parts from that original slab. So I can take these through the milling process, get them brought down into square and flat and all that good stuff, take them down to final width, and then I'm actually going to make a mitered door for this. I think the mitered look on the door frame is going to match really nicely with the mitered corner of the dovetail, so we have a nice 45-degree angle kind of translating from the outside of the case through to the inside corner of the door. I think it's going to look real nice. Now this is also going to be a glass door, or I guess a polycarbonate or acrylic or whatever I decide to put in here. So I'm going to need a rabbet in these pieces as well. So once those miters are all cut on there, I can run a rabbet on the inside edge to hold the glass and a retaining strip, and then we can be ready for a little bit of joinery. The frame looks like it's fitting together really nicely. It is sized to be about 1/8 of an inch bigger in both directions than the opening. That way I can trim it down to fit perfectly in there. And before gluing up, I'm going to reinforce the connections with some floating tenons, also known as dominoes. Another option here for reinforcement would be a spline, but I don't want an exteriorly visible piece of joinery on this frame. So an internal thing like this, which would be totally hidden, is what I'm going to go with. And once those mortises are all cut, this frame is ready for glue up. While the glue is drying on the door frame, I'm going to start working on the hinge mortises here on the case. So I have some nice precision butt hinges from Horton Brasses here, which I'll use to hang the door. So to lay out the actual location of the mortise, I know I want this hinge to be on the door, basically down the stile, the thickness of the rail. So this is the stock for the door, so that puts this hinge right here. So I'm just scrap around this guy. And then I'll set the depth going into the case with a marking gauge. And exactly the same thing down here. Now I can just excavate that material with a router and then chop back to the lines. Now, one thing you might notice or be thinking is that the hinge on the bottom is pretty close to that lower divider, so it's probably going to be impossible to get the router all the way in there and mortise all the way for that hinge. That is absolutely true. What I could have done was mortise for these hinges before the case was glued up, but I figured I would do it the hard way to show you that it's not really that hard to mortise one of these things with a little bit of hand tool work. And in situations like this, if you know how to mortise by hand, these situations won't be scary at all. Don't be too afraid of hand tools. They may save your butt someday. So with that out of the way, I think kind of the next thing is going to be fitting this door into the case. And before I do that, I want to install the back. That way, if the back is going to tweak that case at all, it's going to do that, and then I'll have the case in sort of its final shape before fitting the door. So the back just needs to be trimmed down to final size, and then it can be screwed in to the case. So this is going to look pretty darn awesome. I'm getting excited, for real this time. So I think the last major thing to do is to get this door hung on this case. So it is oversized a little bit right now. So I'm going to go through and get this thing trimmed up, get it fitting nicely inside the opening. And then from there, we'll just do some mortising for the hinges into the door. And then this thing will be swinging in its opening. So at this point, the door is still a little bit oversized in the opening. I haven't set the gaps yet, except for one. I have enough space on this side that's going to set the gap over here, because that's where the hinge is going to go. And once that hinge gets mortised in there, we're not going to be able to change that without having to alter the mortise depth. So that one's all ready to go. So with it fitting in here, and I just have it tied up against the side, I can mark the locations of the mortises onto the door stiles, and then lay out those mortises, and then just route out and chop back to those lines to establish the mortises for those hinge leaves in the door. Very much like how we already mortised for the hinge mortises in the case. The only difference now is, I have a little more room to work. So now we can pop some screws in here, and these hinges are going to come with steel screws as well as the final installation brass screws. So I'll use the steel screws now to essentially just widen up the hole, get the threads cut into the wood, so that when we do the final installation, the brass screws don't have a whole lot of work to do, since they are a lot more brittle and have a higher tendency of breaking. So now I just have this gap here to contend with to make sure it's looking good all the way around. So my gap over here actually worked out really nicely. It's sized correctly, so it's the same as it is over here, which looks good. The top needs a little bit of tweaking and the bottom needs a little bit of tweaking. So over here, the gap looks pretty good, but as you get over here though, it kind of goes away to nothing. So there's something goofy going on here, but we can adjust that real quickly with the plane. So I can pull the door out, plane that edge a little bit to straighten up that gap, and then the gap should be fit nicely all the way around. All right, that's looking a lot better. Nice and even all the way through here. All the other gaps match. I think this thing is ready for a little bit of finish. So I'm gonna take this thing apart, get the door and the case all sanded and finish prepped, break all the edges, all that stuff, and then throw on a few coats of finish. So the cabinet is mounted to the wall, and for that I use some lag shields since I have a concrete block construction wall here. So those just get mounted into some holes, and then the whole cabinet can be lag bolted into those lag shields. Now the biggest consideration with this setup is kind of putting the mounting hardware in a place that's going to be covered by whatever's going to go into this cabinet. So I positioned mine to be covered by my bit holders, which are very easily constructed because that's the mood I'm in right now. So to start those off, I ripped a bevel on the back edge. I wanted these things to sort of lean out from the case a little bit to make them easier to pull the bits in and out. So a 9-degree bevel was ripped onto the main block. The blocks were cut to length and they could lay out and drill a bunch of holes in them for all the bits. The 1/2-inch bits, I went a little more conservative on the number of holes. For the 1/4-inch bits, I basically turned my mounting block into Swiss cheese and went a little crazy and drilled a lot more holes in that one. That's going to give me the maximum amount of like reconfigurability and all that, but I'm not too worried about the 1/2-inch one either because I can always pull these things out and drill more holes if I really need to. That's the nice thing about being so simple. It's very easy to change things in the future. Now to mount these things into the cabinet, I made myself some mounting blocks out of some scrap walnut. Again, a 9-degree bevel ripped onto one edge. It's gonna make it line up to the back edge of the bit holders. And then a nice countersunk through hole through that block, which will allow me to put a screw through there and screw the whole assembly to the back of the case. Those blocks just get glued on to the bit holders, and then I can throw some finish on them to make them look a little nicer. This is some leftover thermally modified ash that I had for my outdoor bench. So I used some teak oil on it because I have a lot of that left over as well from that project. So now all I have to do is get these things installed. I have 2 screws to install, and then I can start putting the actual bits into all of these holders. So the bits are all in, and that's looking a lot nicer. I also made some little blocks for various little like bits that might have accessories with them, such as the rabbiting bit here, or over here with the collet blocks. These are just blocks of wood with various things pounded into them to act as little studs for things. So there might be a scrap piece of brass bar stock, or a stainless steel nail, or in the case of the collet holder, that is a 7018 rod that's like partially burnt from the trailer build. So with everything in here and ready to go, let's get the door finished up and installed. So I just cut this piece of plexiglass to fit in here, and I also made these retaining strips out of some scraps. So these will be installed with some screws, and these retaining strips will hold this piece of plexiglass in place, and should look kind of nice. Okay, so that's looking pretty nice. You can see I had to shim the case a little bit to get the door to close flush because my wall is not flat, so I was tweaking the case if I just screwed it directly to the wall. Just something weird with concrete block walls. Anyway, I need a knob on here now, so I actually open this thing. So I got this nice little knob here from Horton Brasses as well, and I'm going to put that centered in the style and its width, and I'm going to put it just a little bit off center, just a little bit higher towards the top. Pop a quick hole in the door, install this knob, and that should be just about it. So my original plan was to mount a magnet here on the divider, which would act as a catch for the door, but I think it stays closed by itself well enough that I'm not going to even bother. So I've had this thing set up here in the shop for a few weeks now, and it is just amazing to have everything organized in one place. I found myself actually putting things away, which is kind of the biggest challenge of a shop organization thing. First of all, having a place to put it, and then actually putting things back. Well, because it's so easy to actually put things back in here, I actually do it. And that's what really matters when it comes to shop organization, is you can build all of the organization things you want, but if you don't put it back, then what's the point of having any organization at all? So if you want to build your own wall hanging display cabinet to display whatever it is you want to display, I do have a full set of plans with a cut list available for free over on my website. There'll be a link to that down in the description, and there'll also be links down there to the supplies and products that I used in this video. So I am super happy with the way this thing turned out. It is very nice to look at in the shop. And again, all my stuff is nicely organized, which is a huge plus for me. So again, a big thank you to MLCS Woodworking for sponsoring this video. Definitely check them out for all your router bits and woodworking supply type needs and things like that. There's a link to their website down in the description. So that's going to do it for this one. Thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments on the router bit cabinet or anything here in my shop, please feel free to leave me a comment, as well as be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.